Let's take a look at the 4-cone serge seam sample. Up until now, we've been using the lock stitch machine to sew our actual seams, and then we figure out a way to clean finish the raw edges of that seam. But let's take a look at what we can do with a 4-cone serger to sew our seam and clean finish the raw edge all in one step. I've got my 5/16 inch seam allowance pattern, and I've cut 2 of them from muslin. Remember to keep the grain line aligned to the grain of the fabric. This should be a really quick sample. I've got my 2 pieces of muslin here. I've clipped into my notches so I have an idea of where my seam line should go. And I'm going to keep these 2 pieces of muslin aligned to one another and go ahead and just pin along this edge. This edge where my notches are is where I'm going to place my seam. Now I've developed this pattern specifically at 5/16 of an inch because that's the average width of a serge stitch on a 4-cone serger. So I'm going to take this sample over to my serger. Here I am at my serger. I'm using my home serger. You might be using the industrial sergers in the sewing studios, but the operation is the same. Make sure you're working on a serger that has 4 cones of thread. If I pan up here, you'll see I have 1, 2, 3, and 4 cones of thread on my machine. The left and right needle should be threaded. You can see here's my left needle here with thread in it, and here's my right needle with thread in it. So both needles should be threaded, both needles should be inserted and threaded. If for some reason they are not, please contact me or a sewing technician. Be mindful of where the cutting edge is on the serger. I have lifted my presser foot here so you can get a better look at it. I can turn my machine just so you can kind of see. There is my scissor edge. Let me turn this light on. There's the scissor edge. Here's the topmost edge here. This big long piece of metal right here. And down here, you may see this tiny little sliver of metal right there. So this piece of metal and this piece of metal, those will oscillate up and down to create a scissor-like cutting effect. And if I manually walk my machine, you will see those 2 pieces of metal. There you go. So just be aware of where that is, because when you align your fabric in the machine, you're going to want to put the raw edge of the fabric just along the left-hand side of this piece of metal so that you don't cut anything off. We want to avoid cutting too much fabric off because our patterns are drafted specifically so that we're not cutting any excess fabric off. Any fabric that goes to the right of this is going to get cut off. So we're going to have to line up the raw edge of the fabric right along there. So lift your presser foot. I've got mine already lifted. If you're using a home serger, there may be a lever in the back to do so. If you're using the industrial machines at school, then there will be a foot pedal to lift that. I'm going to slide my 2 pieces of muslin in here, and I'm going to remove my pin because you do not want to sew over any pins. And as you can see, I've aligned the raw edge, this cut edge of my fabric, right along the left-hand side of this piece of metal. So it's just going to slide right in there so I can be cutting off very little, if any, fabric. And as I'm sewing, I'm going to be peeking right in through here, right between my presser foot and my blade, to make sure that that edge of my fabric is staying where it should. I'm also going to be using my feed dog plate that's sitting right here and ensuring that my raw edge stays aligned so it doesn't tilt out this way or that way. I want to make sure it stays around the same distance. This looks to be about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of my feed dog plate. Lower my foot, and I'm just going to serge straight through. You should already have tails on the machine. If there are no tails on the machine, please contact me or a sewing technician, because the machine may have come unthreaded and it may not do anything when you sew. This is going to be a little bit loud, so I'm just going to let it run so I'm not talking over it. So again, I'm coming to the end here. Again, I'm kind of peeking down in through here, making sure that that raw edge of my fabric is staying to the left-hand side of that oscillating blade. Gonna remove my other pin. Now remember, on a serger or any other looping machine, a machine that does not have a separate bobbin, keep stitching, just stitch off. So I'm going to stitch, and as my fabric comes past my presser foot, I'm going to hold the fabric and kind of guide it back, because there are no feed dogs back here to actually guide my fabric. I'm going to have to guide it manually so that my thread doesn't get bunched up in my needles. And now I will trim my extra threads if I can find a pair of scissors. And I'm just going to trim off these little threads, leaving maybe 1/2 inch of thread tails. Make sure to leave tails on the machine itself, or else if you do not leave thread tails on the machine can come unthreaded and then it'll have to be rethreaded. And I'm going to clean off these extra threads here. I'm just going to leave a little bit of a tail so they don't come unraveled in the sample book. But you can see what a 4-cone serge stitch looks like. If my camera would focus. Oh well. But there is one line of stitching and a second line of stitching, and then one looper on this side and a second looper on the other side. If you had just a 3-cone serge stitch, you wouldn't have this second line of stitching. It would just be a single line of stitching. But this line of stitching here on the bottommost edge is actually your seam. It's already sewn the seam for me. And then the remaining loopers and rightmost needle has clean finished the raw edge for me. So I am going to turn this out. You can see it's sewn my seam there. So you can open this out. This would be the right side of your garment. This would be the wrong side of your garment. Now, unlike a flat seam, we've got both pieces of muslin sewn together here. So you can only press your seam allowances in one direction or the other. So I will take this to my iron and press them flat. It doesn't matter which direction you press them. I'm just going to press them flat. Be sure to pull your fabric kind of taut as you place it on the ironing board, so that when you look at it from the right side, it should be nice and flat. We shouldn't have any fabric rolling onto itself, even a tiny bit. We don't want anything like that. Give it a good taut pull. I'm going to place this down on my ironing board in this orientation so that I can be sure that all of my seam allowance is pressing in the same direction, and then we'll be all done. So here is my 4-cone serged seam sample. This is the right side of the fabric. If I get really close up, you can kind of see these stitches in here, which means that the tension on my serger is off. I'm going to have to go and tighten up some of these threads, but for a sample, it's perfectly fine. The industrial machines should not do this. They should be dialed in pretty well, but my home serger is not nearly as good as the industrial machines, so sometimes they get a little bit off. From the inside or the wrong side of the garment, this is what the finish would look like. I've just pressed all of my excess seam allowance in one direction, so you can see I can lift this up. It could go either direction, but make sure to give this a pull when you're on the iron and press this nice and flat in one direction or the other, and just leave little thread tails at the end so that it doesn't come unraveled. And that is our 4-cone serge seam sample done.